Well, the main thesis is that when we're thinking about making policy, whether it's in the public sector or in companies, in the 21st century, we need to think that people are much more driven by what happens on their networks, that imitation and copying the behavior and opinions of others is the central key to people's motivation and behavior. Now, most policy for the last 50 or 60 years has been driven by the view of economics, that it's really incentives that matter, that people are operating in isolation and they respond rationally to incentives. That view is not wrong, but it's a very partial view in the highly connected world of the 21st century, where copying and imitation across networks is the driving force of people's behavior. Well, the financial crisis of 2007-8 was essentially a network phenomenon. And the problem was that the whole structure of policy, from individual governments, central banks, international regulators, had a completely different view of the world. It was treating banks as if they were operating in isolation and carrying out stress tests on their balance sheets as to their viability. Whereas in fact what we can see now very clearly, it was the connectedness of banks. When Lehman's went under, policymakers realized there was a real threat of a global cascade, of a cascade of bank failures. And that simply wasn't taken account in the regulations which existed or even exist today. And if we move forward and thinking about today, thinking about the potential for economic recovery, again, this is much more a question of networks, but a question of confidence in the corporate sector, that the large companies, both in America and in Europe and here in the UK, have rebuilt their balance sheets. They're sitting on massive piles of cash, but they haven't got the collective confidence to spend that. And when they do, there'll be an economic boom. It's a question of once that confidence starts and people start to copy and imitate it, then the economy will recover very strongly. So the crisis and the recovery are both essentially network phenomena. Well, I think rebuilding confidence on networks, not just of financial institutions, but large corporations, it's a harder task that if you're operating in an isolated world driven by incentives, then it seems as if the world is easy to control. We just know that's simply not true. So it's relevant, for example, to the debate about debt and austerity, that it does seem to be the case that if there are increases in debt, this actually reduces confidence on networks, and we can see this happening in Southern Europe. This is really a question of confidence on networks in the ability of these governments to repay. So austerity and so-called austerity and deficit reduction plans do seem the best way of actually engendering confidence amongst the corporate sector and getting them to spend these large amounts of money and get the economy going again. Well, I think we can point the Chancellor to his own actions immediately after the general election, whereby announcing a plan for control of spending and deficit reduction, even though it's not actually lived up to it, the markets believe that this is the way the British government wants to go. And as a result, we can see that long-term interest rates in Britain are low, around 2%. In Spain, Italy, Greece, they sometimes get to 7 or 8%. So it seems to me that he's basically on the right track. And this was a network phenomenon. People believed the story. They believed the narrative that he created about the willingness of the British government or its ability to control debt and to repay it. People don't believe the narrative, the stories of the Spanish, the Italian, and the Greek governments, and that's why they're in very serious trouble. Well, I think one of the difficulties for policymakers about the network world, and it's a difficulty of reality, it's not a theory, this is how the world actually is, that we can't simply say, if we do this, that will necessarily be the outcome. That in a network world, there's much more uncertainty. Depends whether we can get that narrative to, if you like, cascade across a network and be believed, or whether it's going to stop at an early stage. And we never really know until after the event whether it's worked or not. So it makes policy more uncertain. It doesn't mean that the narrative shouldn't be constructed and attempted. So there are no quick fixes in the network world, and we can see there are no quick fixes in reality. Policymakers just have to keep trying until they get the story right.